You've got shit. I've got shit. We've all got shit. So let's therapize that shit with your host, me, Joy Gerhard. Please note, I am not a therapist. I cannot and do not diagnose anyone or prescribe anything. This is just me, someone who struggles with mental illness, emotions, and intrusive thoughts, sharing what skills I've used and how I've used them. Also, trigger warning, in this podcast, I talk about sensitive topics including mental illness, suicidal ideation, self-harm, rape, childhood sexual assault, trauma, and more. I also swear here and there, so listener discretion is advised. If you're new to the podcast, some context for you. I've gotten a ton of value out of doing group therapy and watching others process their shit. In group, I can see other people's patterns and behaviors much more clearly because they aren't my patterns and behaviors, but rather they're adjacent to mine. It's such a relief. I want to share this relief with you via this podcast, wherein I practice skills while actually in the thick of shit. Each episode, I typically do an introduction and provide some context. Then I play a recording of me actively dealing with shit. This isn't me talking about psychology or theories. I'm actually in distress, having strong emotions and strong urges. You're going to hear me crying, angry, numb. But my intention is always to move through an emotion, never to stay there. So stick with me, and we'll actually come out on the other side by the end of the episode. Alrighty, let's hop to it. Welcome. It is episode 32, which isn't a noteworthy number unless, I guess, you're counting in base 8, which would make it episode 40. But I figured that I would start with a quick introduction to myself, since I haven't really introduced myself in a while, or ever, probably not since episode 1. So I'm going to introduce myself. Hello, I'm Joy. I'm 39. I have PTSD, CPTSD, major depressive disorder, autism, and chronic pain. I am a recovering self-harm addict. I am currently single. That status changed, funnily enough, 3 hours after I recorded my very first podcast episode. I recorded the episode, and then 3 hours later, my partner of 2 years broke up with me. So episodes 2 through probably 10 are me dealing with the breakup. I am currently unemployed and living with my parents. I'm recovering from autistic burnout, and I pay for my therapy by working 1 day a week at a friend's house, helping organize and clean and assemble furniture and assorted stuff. I used to own my own business, too, in fact. I had a graphic and web design business, and I also used to run a makerspace with a business partner. I left that about 7 months after the pandemic shut everything down, when I had a mental breakdown, ergo, recovering from burnout. Before that, I used to work for a general contractor. Before that, I got my master's in marine biology, specifically genetics. I am a multiple rape survivor and a survivor of childhood sexual assault, and I'm currently in DBT therapy for traumatic invalidation. And I'm still alive, which I guess is the only thing that makes me at all qualified to showcase therapy skills. I'm still here because I've been using my skills. So let's jump right on in. We are still chugging away at my back catalog of recording. This week's recording takes place on May 7th, the day after my autism assessment, where I was finally diagnosed. So yes, finally, it's official. The recordings have finally caught up to me being autistic. Huzzah. And I am recording this commentary on December 18th, 2022, so about 7 months later. Though oddly enough, my autism is not totally new information. I mean, the diagnosis is new, but the possibility that I'm autistic is not new. I remember an instance when I was in grad school, probably like 2007, about 15 years ago, when I was chatting with some friends about hobbies, and I described how I do puzzles with an autistic-like level of concentration. And I remember several of my friends looking aghast at me like I had just used some sort of slur to describe myself. I also have a journal entry from July 2012, which is 10 years ago, where I describe how I see myself, which is as follows. I am not an extrovert. I can be outgoing, yes, but I want to be alone after. And I'm incredibly smart, incredibly thoughtful, meaning I think a lot, not that I'm sensitive to people, because that would be funny. I spend a lot of time reading and thinking and writing and processing. I love Latin and languages and roots of words. I love long solo hikes in the mountains. I write novels and screenplays that I never get published because the process is the point. I am confident in my solitude. I build things. I do puzzles at a rate that might suggest autism. I can sit still for hours at a time editing a resume or a PowerPoint presentation and not be at all aware that time has passed. I have the willpower of a monk. I read voraciously, all sorts of things. I love movies. I am blunt. I am very, very honest. I'm incredibly insensitive. I don't make friends easily. I go to level 10 instantly, and I think people assume that it's because I want to be super close with them, but in truth, it's just because I hate small talk. I like to understand things, so I ask a lot of questions. It doesn't mean I want to be someone's friend. I have enough friends, 4 is plenty, thanks. Oh, dear God. How much more autistic could I sound? Okay, and also I found in my email that in 2013, I took what I'm pretty sure was my very first autism questionnaire, the AQ, which stands for Autism Quotient. It's like the IQ test, but that's intelligence quotient. I scored above the threshold for autism, and again, that was back in 2013, but I promptly forgot all about it, apparently, until February of this year, when I started looking into it in earnest. So yes, the recording I'm about to play for you is the day after my diagnosis, and the diagnosis brought up a lot of feelings, like a lot of feelings. There was a lot of grief, and in this recording, a lot of anger. So let me give some context to the recording you're about to hear. It starts with rage. I'm feeling a ton of rage come up as a result of doing a pros and cons exercise around whether or not to tell my parents that I have autism. Pros and cons is a DBT skill. And, oh, wait, hang on. Yes, quick DBT orientation. So most of the skills that I reference in this podcast are from the DBT manual by Marsha Linehan. DBT stands for Dialectic Behavioral Therapy and is my therapy type of choice. The DBT manual is linked in the description both in PDF form and where you can buy a hard copy. Whenever I'm quoting the DBT manual or really anyone else's work other than my own, I turn on a bit of reverb so that I sound like I'm in a NFL stadium, or more accurately, an NFL stadium bathroom. I will be referencing handouts from several of the DBT modules in this episode. There are 4 modules, 4 sections of DBT: mindfulness, interpersonal effectiveness, emotion regulation, and distress tolerance. So when I mention a handout that I'm reading from, I'll say something like, this is from Distress Tolerance, handout 3, or whatever, so you can follow along if you're so inclined. All right, let's talk about pros and cons, because that's where this episode starts. So pros and cons. Let me give you some context. In distress tolerance, there's different groupings of skills. One group is a group of crisis survival skills, and I'm speaking now from Distress Tolerance Handout 2. These are skills for tolerating painful events, urges, and emotions when you can't make things better right away. And the list of skills is as follows. The stop skill, pros and cons, tip your body chemistry, distract with wise mind accepts, self-soothe with the 5 senses, and improve the moment. So when do we use crisis survival skills? I'm now talking from Distress Tolerance Handout 3, entitled When to Use Crisis Survival Skills. Very creative. You are in a crisis when the situation is highly stressful, short-term, that is, it won't last a long term, and creates intense pressure to resolve the crisis now. And something to note, when you're in a crisis, it's not going to feel like it's a short-term situation. It's often going to feel like a long-term situation. But crisis survival skills are for objectively short-term crises. So we use crisis survival skills when 1, you have intense pain that cannot be helped quickly. 2, you want to act on your emotions, but it will only make things worse. 3, emotion mind threatens to overwhelm you and you need to stay skillful. 4, you are overwhelmed yet demands must be met. 5, Arousal is extreme, but problems can't be solved immediately. Don't use crisis survival skills for everyday problems, solving all your life problems, or making your life worth living. So, using distress tolerance decreases our arousal like the arousal of our nervous system. So rather than like having our needle be pegged at our maximum levels all the time, distress tolerance lowers that nervous system arousal for brief periods of time. And invariably, our distress will rise again later, but then we can use distress tolerance skills to lower them again. And it ends up being kind of more like a sine wave graph rather than just a solid line where you're pegged at maximum levels. So let's talk about pros and cons. This is Distress Tolerance Handout 5. Use pros and cons anytime you have to decide between two courses of action. An urge is a crisis when it is very strong and when acting on the urge will make things worse in the long term. So an urge like an urge to self-harm, an urge to go scream at your boss, an urge to like get blackout drunk, what have you. And those urges become crises when they're very strong and when acting on them will actually get in the way of long-term goals. Make a list of the pros and cons of acting on your crisis urges. These might be to engage in dangerous, addictive, or harmful behaviors, or they might be to give in, give up, or avoid doing what is necessary to build a life you want to live. Make another list of the pros and cons of resisting crisis urges. That is, tolerating the distress and not giving in to the urges. Use the grid below to evaluate both sets of pros and cons. So summarized, it's a 2x2 grid. Pros and cons are on the top. Acting on the crisis urge and resisting the crisis urge are on the side. And I have a graphic of this that I will link to in the description. I've also posted them on the Instagram. Before an overwhelming crisis urge hits, write out your pros and cons, carry them with you, and rehearse your pros and cons over and over. When an overwhelming crisis urge hits, review your pros and cons. Get out your list and read it over again. Imagine the positive consequences of resisting the urge. Think of the negative consequences of giving in to the crisis behaviors. Remember past consequences when you have acted on crisis urges. I have an example of a pros and cons that I did for episode 15. That's been on the website for a while. That was for the pros and cons of self-harming or resisting self-harm. In this week's recording, I'm going to be talking about the pros and cons of telling my parents that I have autism or resisting telling them that I have autism. And most of the time, people do a pros and cons list. It's just a pro of doing the thing and the con of doing the thing. The reason that this pros and cons is different because you're doing the pros of doing a thing and the cons of doing a thing, and also the pros of not doing a thing and the cons of not doing a thing. And the pros of acting on an urge and the cons of resisting an urge is where validation lives. That's where I can remind myself, oh, this is why I have such a strong urge, and this is why my brain keeps going there. Because it is a huge relief when I do this thing. It does feel so much better when I do this thing, at least in the short term. Like, it relieves so much pressure. It's a lovely way to validate, like, these urges, I come by them honestly. Like, they come from somewhere. There's a reason that I have these urges. There's a reason my brain keeps going back to them because my brain remembers, hey, when you did that thing, like when you self-harmed, remember, you felt so much relief. You felt so much better. And the cons of resisting would be like, it's so distracting. Like, it's all my brain wants to do and I can't focus on anything else. That's validating. It helps me explain to myself why this urge is so appealing and why I really don't want to resist it. And then the con of acting on the urge and the pro of resisting the urge are kind of like my North Star in terms of like, this is where your long-term goals live. This is where we get into wise mind and remember what I'm trying to do with my life and what I'm up to and what I want my life to look like. And so those are kind of the, not cheerleading, but like the encouraging of like, you got this. Remember what we don't want to go back to. Remember how hard it was to stop self-harming. Remember how much you had to hide it. Stuff like that. I want to make a quick point here too about how I fill out my pros and cons. They don't work if I'm filling out my pros and cons based on what I think other people are going to say. Like for my self-harm one, a con of self-harming, a lot of people would say, oh, it's dangerous and you could really hurt yourself and all of this stuff. And that didn't work for me. Those are not cons that actually occurred in my brain as being downsides. And filling out what are the pros of self-harming? Like other people would say there aren't any pros, but that's not accurate. There are, of course, pros for me. That's why I've done it. And I have to be honest with myself. Like, what do I get out of it? What does it do for me? What is it trying to do for me? What feels good about this thing? And that's where I can validate myself. And then being honest with myself about what are the cons. The biggest con for me around self-harm was that it was creating this rut, this way of thinking, this shortcut in my brain that made it so hard to do anything else because my brain would just automatically go to that thing. And if I wanted to do any other behavior, self-harming got in the way of me learning any other kind of behavior. And it was like I kept digging myself deeper and deeper. And every time I self-harmed, it was like, you're going to have to climb out of this later, Joy. Every foot of dirt you unearth and dig yourself deeper into, you're going to have to climb out later. And having gone many, many years without self-harming at various points, like it's hard to give it up. And each time I self-harm, it makes it harder. So that's my North Star for that. But yes, it was vitally important for me that my pros and cons are actually authentic to my experience and not based off of what society says or what your friends say, but what's actually true for me. So I will be starting the recording talking about the pros and cons that I was doing. And also later in the recording I'm about to share with you, I talk about doing exposure to traumatic invalidation. I went over this in detail in episode 28, so I'm not going to get into it a ton here. Rather, I highly recommend that you just go listen to the first 20 or 30 minutes of episode 28, because I go over what trauma is, what PTSD is, what makes PTSD become chronic, what exposure is, what in vivo and imaginal exposure is, all that good stuff. So go check that out. And the last thing I'll mention, the recording you're about to hear, I'm in my car and it is raining. So you're going to hear a lot of road noise, you're going to hear a lot of rain hitting my car, and you're potentially going to be hearing my windshield wipers. I tried to clean the audio up as much as I could. This is what we've got. Alrighty, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and dive right on in. So past Joy, take it away. Okay, so I am driving right now and having a very, very strong reaction to thoughts I'm having. A lot of anger is coming up, and I figured, let's therapize some shit, shall we? So again, I'm not sitting with my DBT book right now because I'm driving, so I'm going to be doing this on the fly with as much as I can remember on my own. I feel so fucking angry right now. So yesterday I had an assessment for autism, and we're relying on my self-reporting and objective measures of questionnaires like that are evidence-based, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, 2.5 hours of conversation of an interview, and even before we started, I had submitted the questionnaires already. She had said, oh yeah, like you already meet the diagnostic criteria, but we're going to do an interview anyway. So we did the interview, and at the end of the interview she said, I am pretty confident that you meet the diagnostic criteria. So I've been kind of like sitting with this information, and all of this anger is coming up today. It started when I was trying to do the pros and cons for telling my parents, because it kind of feels like coming out. I came out to my parents because it felt, at some point, it was a lie of omission. The number of times I'd be around them and they would mention having 2 queer daughters. In fact, they have 3 queer daughters. They just didn't know. It became more painful to keep it in than to just say, hey, I'm bi, and just throw it out. On my way out the door, literally, is how I did it. And this kind of feels the same way. I have been suspecting that I have autism for, it's kind of like been in the back of my brain that there are certain things I did that I'm like, that feels mildly autistic, for decades, actually. And it wasn't until just a few months ago that I started actually looking at whether I actually am autistic, and took, of course, a gazillion questionnaires that are used by diagnosticians, and didn't just slightly exceed the threshold. I significantly exceeded the threshold on every single metric. So it's been a couple months that I've known that, and I finally had my assessment yesterday, and so it's been one day that it's been confirmed. Anyway, it feels dishonest to keep this from them. That's the thought I'm having. Is it checking the facts? Is that actually the truth? Am I being dishonest by not telling them about this? I don't think so. I mean, unless they come right out and ask, Joy, are you autistic? And I say no, then that would be me lying. So I did pros and cons. Let's talk about the pros and cons that I did. I did pros and cons, long-term and short-term, of telling them and of not telling them. So the short-term pros of telling them is that I get to get it out of my body. I get to tell them, and I no longer feel like I'm lying. That's a short-term pro. It's also probably a long-term pro of telling them. Oh, another pro of me telling them is that my sisters would be able to speak freely about it. All three of us have at various times been in the closet, and it's important to remember when having conversations with other people who's out and who's not, so we don't out somebody accidentally, and the same would kind of be true of this. I want my sisters to be able to speak freely to my parents and not have to watch what they say, so that would be a potential pro of me telling my parents. A possible long-term pro is that they gain a better understanding of me, and with a friendship, having a better understanding of the experiences of my friends helps me be a better friend, and it actually makes our friendships deeper. So in that way, I think that could be a pro of telling them, that it could enhance our relationship and that they would understand me better. Flip side, the con of telling them is that they might not understand me better. In fact, they might have a lot of presuppositions and assumptions about autism that would actually have them misunderstand me more, because they could potentially jump to a bunch of conclusions based off the limited experience that they have with autism, which mostly includes movies like Rain Man and The Accountant, and I can't think of others, but I know that there are others. But it's overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male, very limited depictions of what autism looks like. So the cons of telling them is that I'm sure they have assumptions, and I don't want to do the work or the effort of ferreting those things out and correcting them and or educating them. So that would be one of the boundaries that I would have to put into place, is hey, I have this thing. Here, let me give you literally all of the results that I have, because I have all of the results in an Excel table, and I can give them a website, and they can go and do all of the research themselves. It does not have to be me educating them. And I have very low confidence that they would actually do that, because they have not been willing to do that around other issues that have come up. So a potential con is that I would tell them, and then they would not do the work of educating themselves or unlearning their assumptions, and that they might actually understand me less. They could have judgments about what it means that I have autism. So that's another potential con of me telling them. And another con of me telling them, and this is actually kind of a big one, I have a boundary right now of not telling them how I feel about things. Because I currently do not have the ability to be with their invalidation of me and not be completely demolished by it, which is why I'm doing exposure. That's a boundary that I have right now, not to talk to them about how I feel. So a con of telling them would be that I'd have to be really intentional about the way that I tell them. I'd have to basically, because it can't be a situation where I tell them and then we have a discussion about how I feel about it. No. We're not going to have a discussion about how I feel about it. So I would have to say, basically, here are the test results. here's a spreadsheet, here's a website, read everything here before you ask me a single question. And Godspeed to you. And that I won't be answering questions about how I feel about it, and that I don't want to talk about the impact that they have had on me for my entire life, not being aware that this is my experience, and judging and trying to fix my experience. A con would be that it could potentially get in the way of what I'm trying to do in therapy, which is to, right now, while I'm doing exposure to invalidation, I'm purposefully not putting myself in situations where I am guaranteed to continue to be invalidated. So this is one of the situations I actually don't know how it would go. And yeah, okay, fine, great. So those are the pros and cons of me telling them. What are the pros and cons of me not telling? A pro of me not telling them is that I don't have to deal with any potential invalidation from them around this. So that would be great. Another pro of not telling them is that I really wouldn't have to be around any of their emotional reaction to this. One of the most painful things that my parents do when I share information with them is to be completely silent. And when I ask them what they're thinking, they'll say they're just taking in the information. That is not active listening. The problem, the frustration I have with that is that, at least for me, and I don't know if anyone else has this experience, but when somebody is listening to me, I need cues that they've heard and understood me. Otherwise, it's literally like talking to a wall. So their silence does not communicate that they've heard and understood me. I do not feel understood in that moment. And it can be super, super invalidating. It literally is like talking to a statue. And that's a concern that I have, that they would react with nothing. And I get it, right? Like, I understand being told a big piece of information and you're like, hang on a second. I am not able to process this fully right now. I need a minute to process some things. Like, that's fine, but communicate that, fucking say that. Otherwise, I'm left there going, Earth to mom and dad, like, I think of the line from Rush Hour. Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? Like, am I making noise right now? And this is what contributes to my derealization and depersonalization. I so often feel like I'm a ghost. Like, I'm not making any noise. Like, there is nothing that I'm doing that is having an impact on them. Like, I cannot get them to acknowledge me. And this is, again, not consistent and not around every topic. And there are enough topics where this happens. And enough times when this has happened that is frequently my experience. That, like, hello, can you hear? Is anyone there? Like, am I making noise? Are you hearing the words I'm saying? Are you understanding the words I'm saying? So a pro of not telling them is not having to deal with that potentially. Again, checking the facts. It is not a certainty that is how they will respond. It is a possibility given previous interactions, recent previous interactions. Like, I'm not going into ancient history here. This is recent history, like within the last couple months. Oh, another pro of not telling them is that it is much easier to stay on track with my plan to not tell them how I feel. There's not the potential for me ignoring a boundary and telling them how I feel if I'm not telling them at all. So that would be a benefit. So some cons of not telling them means that I have to be careful about what I say and, like, purposefully not mention that I'm autistic around them, and that my sisters also have to do that. which is not a con that I take lightly for them or for me. Just that constant awareness of don't slip up around this. And then another con of not telling them is that it does kind of feel like a secret. Like I was mentioning about knowing I was bi, but not having told them yet. I felt like I was holding water in my mouth. At some point, you want to be able to just either swallow it or let it out, right? And that's what this kind of feels like, especially because it's been such a, I mean, the last 3 months, I think, has been when I've been digging into this really super hardcore. And it is very much impacting my emotional state. I have roller coasters all over the place, and I haven't been wanting to record episodes because I'm like, I don't even know how to say how I feel, which of course is the time to use the observe and describe skill, so I haven't been skillful. Yeah, the con of not telling them is that I feel kind of emotionally constipated around it. And I certainly could use skills around that. Like I could practice radical acceptance around, I am not going to tell them, so let's accept that I'm not going to tell them, and do some emotion regulation around, I think it's guilt. It's unjustified guilt that I would be feeling, that I'm keeping this from them. So yes, those are my pros and cons. It is very difficult for me to assign weight to those. And the fact is, I feel angry. I feel angry that all of the things that were labeled as personality flaws, when it really is my neurological wiring, and that there were indications from a very, very early age, stories that my mom tells about me having meltdowns that wouldn't get better even when the supposed trigger was addressed. Because an autistic meltdown is different than a tantrum. It's sensory overload, and it will persist even when the quote-unquote trigger is removed because there's a buildup of overload. And I used to have meltdowns and tear apart my room and rip apart books, and my younger sister grew up thinking I was the favorite child because mom and dad spent so much more time dealing with my behavior. It just fucking sucks. I saw a TikTok the other day because TikTok knew I was autistic before I did. It was a woman who had gone to get diagnosed as an adult, and her diagnostician was like, we never get to see cases like this. We never get to see somebody come in and diagnose them as autistic who don't also have trauma around their experience of growing up. In her case, her parents, they didn't seek out a diagnosis. They just accepted that this is what her needs were, and they made accommodations for her because she's a human being who struggled with a thing, and instead of being try harder, rub some dirt in it, it was okay, this is the thing you struggle with, so you're not a fan of sensory stuff, and you don't like this texture, and all of this stuff, we'll make accommodations for that. And so she doesn't have trauma around feeling invalidated and judged growing up. And I'm fucking in exposure therapy for traumatic invalidation. I don't believe my own experience. I don't believe I'm real. I don't believe my memories are real. Half the time, I'm not even convinced that when I speak, my parents are hearing the words that come out of my mouth. And the analogy that I keep using with my therapist is that I spent a semester in France in undergrad and was taking, ichthyology and statistics and organic chemistry in French, as one does. And, having conversations with my classmates and whatnot. And I could understand them much better than I could speak, which I think is kind of a universal experience of learning a language, is that you're able to understand more before you're able to speak more. And so I could understand what they were saying and the depth at which they could get the details that they could describe their experiences with. But I could not describe my own experience in the same level of detail. I was basically communicating with a second grade vocabulary and a second grade grammar. Unless we were talking about fish. If we were talking about fish, I could go hard all day long. But my conversational French was not up to par. So I had this experience of feeling like locked in. Like I had all these thoughts and feelings that I had no way of expressing. And I could try, and they could get like a tiny little piece of it, but it was nowhere near the fullness of my experience. They were only getting like a 2-second clip, like a 2-second clip of a full movie, right? And there was also a very large chance of misunderstanding. And that's what it feels like trying to explain myself to people. I literally don't have the words for it. I use analogies and I use movies to reference, to explain. And I experience actually quite a bit of anxiety around when I go to explain something and I go to use a movie as a reference, when the person I'm talking to hasn't seen that movie. Like, that's my lifeline. And it wasn't until I started doing exposure therapy that I realized how few people have ever seen the movie Fight Club, because that's the movie that I use to explain exposure therapy. The scene where Brad Pitt burns the back of Ed Norton's hand with lye, and he gives him a chemical burn. And Ed Norton just has to sit there and hold his hand still while his flesh is burning and accept it. And I'm like, yes, that is what exposure feels like. It feels like lighting myself on fire. And it's not that the fire ever gets put out. It's not that the fire stops hurting. It's that my relationship to the pain changes. It's like, oh, I can feel this pain. That's fine. I don't have to do anything with it. I can just feel it. It is not surprising that I have been really struggling to record an episode since I started doing exposure. Like, I'm using up all my bandwidth to do exposure, because it's like an hour. It is literally an hour a day, and it's a lot. And the reason I'm doing this is why I'm fucking angry. The reason I'm doing this is because my parents are not currently doing the work that would have them stop invalidating me and learning how to validate me. And because I live with them and will for the foreseeable future, because I don't have a job or any way of making any income so I could live separately, I therefore need to have A, really strong boundaries, and B, I need to be basically bulletproof around invalidation, because invalidation is an inevitability. Even my parents aside, future jobs, I will experience invalidation. Future relationships, I will experience invalidation. Current friends and family, I will experience invalidation, because that's part of what we do as humans. We either intentionally or unintentionally invalidate each other. And I am also, as it turns out, a neurodivergent, disabled, mentally ill person. So the chance of me being invalidated is even higher, because none of those experiences are ones that are valued or honored or validated in our society. Blah, 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 blah. Preaching to the choir. At any rate, I need to be bulletproof around invalidation. So I'm doing this exposure because my parents are not doing the work of learning how to validate and unlearning how to invalidate. And it fucking sucks. There are days when I can accept it, and today is not one of them. Like, I am so pissed off that I will spend the next year doing this every fucking day so that I can survive when they are unwilling to do the work. And I resent it. What can I say? I fucking resent it. I really want them to do the work. I really want them to go to fucking therapy. And I'm clearly judging that they're not. I'm really fucking angry about it. And, like, I'm also angry that as I'm processing this autism diagnosis, putting on a pair of sunglasses and looking at my life with those sunglasses on and going, oh, I see. Here are all the instances. Like, one of the earliest times that I was ever disciplined by a teacher was in 5th grade, when I got mad at him for changing our seating arrangements. Like, he changed the orientation of the desks in the room, and I couldn't handle it. And I told him it was stupid. And so he made me copy dictionary pages, which was his way of giving attention to a 5th grader. But yeah, like, I have historically not dealt well with change or disorganization. My mom tells stories of me lining up my toys as a toddler, like wanting things to be organized, wanting there to be a place for things, having these meltdowns, not knowing what to do with me. And I, of course, over the course of growing up, learned to shrink myself and to make myself smaller so that I would not have the impact on other people that apparently was so painful for them. But like, the signs were there. I don't judge them for not knowing, because how much information did anybody have about anything in the 80s? I mean, where would one even go to look things up? What would you even look what would be your search term even? And they were strongly evangelical, so all of their child rearing and parenting information was being filtered through evangelical literature and the church. So there wasn't going to be a great opportunity for them to encounter what autism could look like in girls, much less autism just in general. The bigger thing I think that I'm angry about is that they judged me so hard. My dad used to call me stubbornly negative, and did right up until, gosh, I don't know, sometime within the last year. Stubbornly negative. Rigid, even, for my fellow autistics out there. And the way I explain it is, I have found a tiny little pocket of safety. Like, I think of Iron Maiden's The Torture Device. I don't know if it was ever actually used. It's not a torture device, it kills people. What am I saying? Anyway, it's basically a human-shaped coffin with spikes on either side of it. So you put a person in and skewer them through when you shut the door. Well, so I'm in an Iron Maiden, and it has exactly a joy-shaped void inside that if I stand perfectly still and don't move, I will be okay. And I'm in an Iron Maiden. I would like to get out of this Iron Maiden. And a lot of conversations with my dad, he's like, okay, let me take your hand and pull you this way. And I'm like, ouch! This is what these conversations feel like. He's like, I'm trying to help you. Why are you complaining? Why are you refusing to be helped? And the thing is, the thing he's doing isn't actually helping. But his interpretation of that is I am being literally stubbornly negative, because he thinks he is objectively helping. And if I'm not being helped, it's because I am choosing not to be. I refuse to be encouraged. I refuse to be cheered up. I refuse to be helped. Rather than the possibility that he actually doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about, and what he's suggesting isn't in fact solving my problem. It may be solving a problem, a very superficial, surface, obvious problem, but the underlying issue, all the way underneath all of it, is that you don't fucking understand me. And I just really, really want to be fucking understood. I want him to get it. And if he can't get it, I at least want him to make an effort to get it. He used to argue with me when I was in middle school and high school to do less homework, to study less. Because as he saw it, I had no social life. I would come home and go straight into working on homework and do that until I went to bed, which is accurate. That is exactly what I was doing. And he would, when exams would come around, say, hey, just reverse engineer what score you need to get on your exam to keep your A grade, and just study that much, because that's how he would do it. He didn't understand in middle school in high school, in college, or in grad school that I was actually not aiming for the A. I was aiming for mastery. It hurts in my brain to have to look for a piece of information. I wanted to know something so well that it felt innate, and I could just regurgitate it with no neural energy whatsoever. And that was what I was aiming for. But he would argue with me in middle school, in high school, in college, and in grad school that I was studying too much, rather than understanding that I had a different motivation than he did. And I finally found the words after grad school of like, this is what motivates me. And he went, oh, okay. And we have never had a conversation about what it was like for me for 20 years for him to try to fix a thing that wasn't actually a problem for me. It was a problem for him. It was a perceived problem for him. But like, I could write a tome, a big fucking ass book around all of the instances like that, where I was trying to communicate, no, what you're saying does not apply to me. I don't have that experience. I have a different experience. All of these instances when I have tried to communicate and have gone unheard or misunderstood. And I feel really fucking angry as I'm looking back through my life and being like, oh my God, this was there from like toddlerhood. Up until now. And even with like my former partner, we have two instances that were kind of like mythological in our relationship. My sunglasses meltdown and my burnt grilled cheese meltdown. I had these two big meltdowns over not being able to find my sunglasses, and on a separate day, burning my grilled cheese sandwich, where even when the problem was solved, my meltdown didn't stop. And it turns out that the meltdown was actually not about my sunglasses, and it wasn't about my grilled cheese. Those were the final straw in both cases, but I was having overload. His experience of me was that I went from a totally reasonable adult human to a toddler. And I'm like, well, you're not wrong. It fucking sucks to be around people who assume that my behavior doesn't make sense, rather than to be around people who assume it does make sense and then do some work to actually figure out how it makes sense. And I get it. Like, I get that the majority of the world is not going to spend a huge amount of time trying to understand me. There's a lot of people in the world, and really, I only have that expectation of my very closest friends and family, which I think is a reasonable expectation to have, that the people I'm in close relationships with would want to and spend the time to understand me. Maybe that is an unrealistic expectation. If nothing else, it would be lovely to be surrounded by people who, even if they weren't going to spend the time trying to understand, just on some base level goes, you know, this behavior makes sense. I don't know how it makes sense, but I'm sure that it does. And so in the absence of understanding how, I'm just going to accept that it makes sense in some way. And stop fucking judging me. God, I'm angry. I'm fucking angry. And this just feels like another nail in the coffin. And I'm using a lot of very morbid metaphors right now. But like, my parents already didn't understand me around my mental illness, having PTSD, and as it turns out, CPTSD, which are two different things. And it's weird having both of them. And they already don't understand me around my sexuality, that I am bi or pan. I don't really know. I mean, I'm just attracted to whoever. Doesn't really matter what your gender is or your orientation. Really, if I have a sexuality, it's therapy going. I'm attracted to people who go to therapy. But yes, so they don't understand my sexuality either. I would also argue that they don't understand my gender, because I am, in the words of Hannah Gatsby, gender not normal. I mean, like, I guess I identify as a woman. I use she, her pronouns because he, him doesn't feel right, and I've never actually tried on they, them. But there go my windshield wipers again. Shut up. I clearly am not, I am gender not normal. Like, I do not meet the criteria for women. And I've been getting into arguments with my dad about gender for 20 fucking years. Basically, when for over 20 years now, like, kind of like end of high school, I started pushing back against things. I was like, so I guess I was trying to figure out, like, how to be correct. Like, how do I be? And so I would ask questions and he would give answers. And I'm like, no, I don't really buy that. And we would get into fights about it. So just having the thought that there are a lot of areas where my parents don't understand me as it is. And this is just another one. And I feel angry about it. And under normal circumstances, I would be like, fuck it. Like, they don't need to understand me. I will go forth and have my own life. And yes, except they're also my roommates. So I can make requests, I can make observations, and they don't honor them. I mean, like, my door lock is an excellent example. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. I've been back living with my parents for 9 years, and then I basically moved in with my partner for a couple years, and then when he broke up with me, I moved back in. And for the entirety of the time that I have lived with my parents, my mother has walked in to my room without knocking, or knocked and then just come in without waiting for me to say, come in. She's also talked to me through the door, and I have requested repeatedly, and we're not just talking once or twice, but dozens, probably actually over 11 years, hundreds of times. Other people have talked to her about that for me. And it wasn't until, I actually don't remember because time has no meaning. I want to say like January or February of 2022, this year, that I finally put a lock on my door. And she didn't speak to me for 2 days. She was so angry. There's a lot of things that I don't want to speak for her about because I want to honor her privacy. But she finally did get it. She had a conversation with my sister, and she had a conversation with me that had her finally get it. And I'm fucking angry. I'm angry that I made a request dozens, if not hundreds of times, and she didn't honor it. And there is, I want to say it's Portia Noir on TikTok that said, you don't need to understand my boundary in order to respect it. Yeah, you don't need to understand my boundary in order to respect it. And I think it is a very, very white thing that you need to explain to me your boundaries so that I can determine if it's valid, if your reasoning is valid enough for me to respect your boundary. And that's not okay, and it does not work. I mean, I guess it works for us white people. But yeah, like, she didn't understand it, so she didn't respect it. And I tried to explain it over and over and over again, and I think actually that probably made it worse because it sent the message that, oh, you need to understand it in order to respect it. No, I'm going to just, I have this strong urge to just stop explaining myself to people and be like, no, I'm not going to explain my no or my boundaries to you anymore. This is my boundary. Fucking respect it. And it is very frustrating for them to start getting things now that have had an impact on me for nigh on a decade, over a decade, multiple decades, depending on what the topic is. And I feel angry about it. And I like to think I'm justified because one of the justifiable reasons for anger, one of the prompting events, not interpretations, but actual events, is having a goal thwarted or blocked. And this is me having my goal of my boundaries being respected, consistently being blocked, and I feel fucking angry about it. Okay, let's observe and describe. Where do I feel the anger in my body? I feel it in my throat. I feel it in my gut, my kind of lower part of my stomach. I feel it in my lungs. I'm noticing that I'm scowling, so I'm furrowing my brow. I'm contracting my corrugators for you anatomy fans out there. I'm holding a lot of tension in my jaw. I'm holding a lot of tension in my glutes, actually, which is possibly a stimming thing because I do that all the time. I am holding a tremendous amount of tension in my jaw. So we're gonna yawn, wiggle it around a bit. It's all justified, right? Like, it all makes sense. I don't know that there's a person alive who would go, yeah, you shouldn't be angry at your parents, except for probably other parents. See, here's the thing. I do 1,000% believe that they did the absolute best that they could, and they made the best possible decisions for me around raising me that they could. Where it breaks down, though, is that we are still in relationship and we are still cohabitating together. So they are still impacting me in a variety of ways now. And a significant portion of my anger is not because they're parenting me, it's because they're my roommates and they don't respect my boundaries. Honest to God, I feel less than human. I'm having the thought that I'm less than human, that I am not worthy of respect. And this is where I get judgmental. This is absolutely a judgment because I have the thought that they should respect my boundaries. And then I have the thought, well, what if they don't have that skill? Like, great. Well, then they should be learning it. That's where I get judgmental. They should be learning it. And they should have a fucking fire lit under their asses to go out and learn this thing. I'm gonna wax eloquent about biology for a second here. The dinner death principle. This is a grossly oversimplified explanation. Simply put, if a lion is chasing a gazelle, there is stronger pressure on the gazelle to outrun the lion than there is on the lion to outrun the gazelle. Because if the lion fails to catch the gazelle, the lion goes hungry. If the gazelle fails to outrun the lion, the gazelle dies. So there is different pressure on those two individuals to accomplish their goal. And I understand that there is different pressure on me to understand myself than there will ever be on anyone else to understand me. Like, quite literally, I had to go to therapy or else I would be dead. Given my extreme history of suicidal ideation and self-harm, I would not be alive right now if I hadn't gone to therapy. So my life was in danger. My parents' lives are not in danger. So there's less pressure on them to understand. And I get that. Logically, I understand that. And let's get dialectic here. It has a fucking impact on me. I am impacted by it. So again, that's why while I'm doing exposure, I had to set this boundary of I will not be talking to my parents about how I feel. And the reason for that is, and this is fun, this is a fun example. My therapist was giving an example of, let's say you're bitten by a dog and you develop PTSD from this dog bite and you're terrified of dogs. And so you go to therapy to do exposure therapy to dogs, to unpack that, to process it so that you can be around dogs because it's getting in the way of you being able to live your life. You don't start by going and petting a Rottweiler. What you would start with is processing the memory, and then you would do exposure to imagining yourself being in a room with a dog. Let's sit here and imagine that you're in a room with a dog. You're not even touching it. It's all the way on the other side of the room. And then let's imagine walking up to the dog. And then let's imagine petting the dog. And then let's do all of those things for real. But it's like a gradual thing. You do not jump into the deep end. You do not go and pet a Rottweiler. You certainly don't go and interact with a dog that has a history of biting. So my therapist's point was, we're going to be doing exposure to invalidation, but we are not going to be using my parents as a source of that invalidation. They are the biting dogs. So yes, I'm doing exposure to a whole host of invalidation, including right now a podcast episode from The Daily, which is the New York Times podcast, that's an interview with Donna Rotunno, Harvey Weinstein's lawyer. She is the lovely human who said that she had never been sexually assaulted because she would never put herself in that position. So that is the episode. I'm listening to that interview. over and over and over and over again. And I think at this point I've listened to it for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 4 weeks, I think. I'm 7, so 28 times. I mean, that's invalidating as fuck as a sexual assault survivor, a multiple sexual assault survivor, a multiple rape survivor. So that's the sort of exposure. And that's a 30. When I was coming up with my list of greatest hits, of things I was avoiding, I had to write them all down and say on a scale of 0 to 100 in terms of how much distress these things cause me. She's a 30. That interview was a 30. That's where we entered in. And if you're interested in understanding more about what my exposure therapy is like, I have an episode of what exposure therapy is like. You can go check that out. So at any rate, I'm not going to be doing exposure to the biting dog, which means that while I'm doing exposure to invalidation, I will not be seeking out invalidation from my parents. And in fact, quite the opposite, I will be putting up very, very strong boundaries between me and my parents in situations where they may be invalidating. And I'm angry because I really want to go fight about this. Like, I want to tell them the impact that it has had, hearing these stories about me, that I am stubbornly negative, having them tell these stories about me to other people in my family so that they also relate to me that way, and so that I relate to myself that way, as opposed to it being a situation where I actually am communicating that I am in a lot of pain and there's a need I need to be met. And to be non-judgmental about it, the way in which I did that did not work for my dad. He did not like that is how I communicated my needs to him. And part of me is like, yeah, well, I was 12. Like, I was a kid. I am much more effective at communicating my needs now, but I still don't do it in the way my dad likes, because up until very recently, he still related to me as stubbornly negative. It's just fucking discouraging, guys. I really wish that they understood. Okay, so here's what I want to say. I really wish they fucking cared enough about me to actually, do the work. Okay? Let's be non-judgmental about it. I really wish that they showed up for me the way I wanted them to show up for me. I really wish that they would show up for me the way I wish they would show up for me. And that they would engage in behavior, i.e. going to therapy, that looks the way I want it to look and at the speed I want them to do it at. I know they love me. They're letting me live in their home. I know they love me. Hell, I know they like me. And I love them, and I actually like them too. I enjoy the hell out of my parents. And you guys are only going to be hearing, the things that aren't working. But I really enjoy my dad. I enjoy watching really bad action movies and talking through the entire thing about all of the inaccuracies, the physics and the chemistry that's inaccurate. I like playing catch with him. I like working on household projects with him. And to be dialectic, clearly I can enjoy him and also be very hurt by some of his behavior toward me. And my mom, I enjoy the hell out of my mom. I like working on projects with her too. Most of our projects are around sewing or yard work. I like watching movies with her. I like chatting with her. She's the only person in the world who can tickle me. And periodically she'll chase me around the house. There's a lot of awesome fucking memories, really great memories that I have with my parents. And I certainly don't want to downplay those, or even start thinking that they don't love me or that they don't love me enough. Really what it comes down to is that they are not behaving in a way I wish they would, and they are not doing the behaviors, going to therapy, that I wish they would do, and they are not learning new behaviors, like how to validate, at a rate that I wish they would learn it. And in the meantime, their current behaviors of invalidation have an impact on me that does not feel good, and that I don't like. That's one of the wonky things about non-judgment is it kind of, I still have the judgments, clearly. Like I said, here's what I want to say. And I think the skill of non-judgment, as my therapist pointed out recently, because they're a menace and they're very good at their job, that the skill of non-judgment does not mean not having judgments. We're human beings, we're going to have judgments. It's what our brain does. And it's a good thing that our brain does it, actually. We are constantly judging things as, this is safe, this is not safe, this is good, this is bad. It's a shortcut, and it is most of the time very effective for us. It gets us into trouble sometimes too, though. And that's where being able to take that judgment and turn it into a non-judgment is skillful. And certainly me having these judgments about my parents add to my misery. There's a difference, and I know the difference between pain and misery. Pain and suffering, there we go. I know the difference between pain and suffering. As we've talked about before, suffering is pain without acceptance. So it's having pain and then being in pain about our pain, rather than having pain, and that is it. Which isn't to say the pain itself isn't painful. It absolutely is, but having pain about the pain it creates misery, creates suffering. Like being non-judgmental about my parents and their behavior doesn't mean it stops hurting me. It means that I stop suffering about it. And it is also, incidentally, God, I fucking hate it when this shit works. It's what allowed me to put a boundary in place. This is the thought exercise I did. If I accept that my parents do not have the skill of validation and very much have the skill of invalidation, what would I do? What would I do? Not what would I demand that they do, what would I do? And that's where my boundary came up. It's like, okay, well, if they don't know how to validate how I feel, and that they often invalidate how I feel, and I do not currently have the skill, the ability to be with that invalidation and not be destroyed by it, here's the boundary that I need. I need to stop talking to them about how I feel while I'm gaining that skill of being able to be around other people's invalidation of me and not having it feel like the end of the world, which is how it currently feels. So non-judgment, practicing non-judgment and practicing acceptance that this is where they're currently at is what allowed me to see, okay, this is the boundary that I need. And I feel fucking angry. I'm fucking angry. I'm angry that this is how this is going. I'm angry that I don't get to tell them the impact that they're having on me. I'm angry that I don't get to relate to them. Well, more, I'm sad. I feel sad that I don't get to relate to them the way I wish I could. And I know they want to be relating to me too. We both want to be relating to each other on a deeper level. The other problem is, here's an analogy that I like to use. I'm playing professional baseball. The World Series, in fact. I'm out on the field in the middle of a World Series game. And a 6-year-old runs onto the field and says, hey, I want to play too. I've got my bat. Go ahead and pitch. There's a couple different things. There's a couple different mechanisms going on here. One is the child's lack of understanding at all that is involved in this game. He thinks he can play because he thinks he understands the game. 2, he thinks he is skilled enough to play the game that he thinks is being played. Now, notice there's a difference. He thinks he's skilled enough to play the game he thinks is being played. Because it's not that he fully understands all of the, every little nuance of baseball. He thinks it's simple, or simpler than it is, and that he has the skill to play it. And I can absolutely want to play catch with that kid. I can be like, you know what? I would love to play. I'd love to pitch to you. I'd love to have catch with you. Let's get your friends together and do this. But this is not the place. This is not the field. We're in the middle of a professional, actually Major League World Series game. You cannot be here. You do not have the skill to do this thing. And in fact, if I pitch a ball to you, it is likely I could kill you. I could wound you so much. And this is the challenge. When my parents want to have these deep conversations with me, and I'm like, there's a skill deficit here. I don't have the skill to be with their invalidation and not be sidelined by it. they don't have the skill of validating. So there is actually a limit to what we will be able to talk about in a way that's not hurtful to each other. I mean, we could absolutely have the conversations and we would end up hurting each other really badly. I am choosing not to have these conversations with my parents right now. And it's a dialectic, it's both. And I really want to. And I'm really bummed. And I'm also really angry. I'm bummed that we can't have the relationship that I wish we could have. And I'm angry that I'm not able to tell them about the impact that they had on me. Have, present tense, too. So there's a lot of feels. And I'm feeling calmer about it now. Like, I'm still angry and I'm still sad. And it's not this overwhelming, I want to scream at the world feeling. Fucking, I hate it when these skills work. Okay, I'm going to throw back to future joy. Welcome back to the future. I love how at the end there I'm so annoyed at skills working because clearly my emotional reactivity at the end of the recording is very different than how I was feeling at the beginning of the recording. And this annoys me. I'm so often annoyed when skills work. And I actually have an episode about that, episode 29, where I have a conversation with my sister about our mutual annoyance when skills work, because apparently this is a common enough experience for both of us. Alrighty, so I want to go over a couple different skills that I used in addition to pros and cons. I talked about one of my favorite moments from the recording. I talk about being really angry. And then I'm like, okay, and let's do some observe and describe about that. Like my tone changes almost instantly. And it's like I go into kind of this clinical, like observer personality rather than being super in my feelings. Observe and describe are two of the most foundational mindfulness skills. And remember, mindfulness is one of the modules in DBT. And mindfulness is broken down into what skills, the what we do when we're mindful, and also how skills, how we do those things. So what skills are listed on Mindfulness Handout 4, and they include observe, describe, and participate. And the how skills are on Mindfulness Handout 5, and those are non-judgmentally, one mindfully, and effectively. So putting those two handouts together, in order to be mindful, we observe non-judgmentally, one mindfully, and effectively. We describe non-judgmentally, one mindfully, and effectively. And we participate non-judgmentally, one mindfully, and effectively. And all of those actions help us get into wise mind, which is a tool for seeing what is real and true, rather than being stuck in our own interpretations and our own lens. So let's talk about observe. Observing happens in the nanosecond before we start talking to ourselves about what we've observed. We spend most of our time in the describe, but observe happens right before that. So what do we do in order to observe? Notice your body sensations coming through your eyes, ears, nose, skin, and tongue. Pay attention on purpose to the present moment. So what's happening right this second, right here? Control your attention, but not what you see. Push away nothing, cling to nothing. Practice wordless watching. Watch thoughts come into your mind and let them slip right by like clouds in the sky. Notice each feeling rising and falling like waves in the ocean. And finally, observe both inside and outside yourself. So inside are things like body sensations, thoughts, urges, and our emotions. We observe things outside of ourselves with our five senses. So touch, taste, hearing, sight, and smell. Now describe. Here are some ways that we can practice describing. Put words on the experience. When a feeling or thought arises or you do something, acknowledge it. For example, say in your mind, sadness has just enveloped me, or stomach muscles tightening, or a thought, I can't do this, has come into my mind. Label what you observe. Put a name on your feelings. Label a thought as just a thought, a feeling as just a feeling, an action as just an action. Or, it's not written here, but I included it, an urge as an urge. Now, I don't like the word just because just seems to imply that it's not that big of a deal. So saying all of that again without just, label a thought as a thought, a feeling as a feeling, an action as an action, an urge as an urge. Unglue your interpretations and opinions from the facts. Describe the who, what, when, where that you observe. Just the facts. Remember, if you can't observe it through your senses, you can't describe it. So that's the observe and describe that I used to talk about the very strong feelings of anger that I was experiencing. And so I want to switch over now to the emotion regulation module to talk a little bit about anger, because I was saying in the recording that my anger is justified because my need to have my boundaries respected was being blocked. And that is an event that causes justified anger. So let's talk about anger for a second. Anger is the very first emotion in Emotion Regulation Handout 6. Emotion Regulation Handout 6 is one of the big Mac daddies of DBT, and I'm regretting saying that. It has 10 pages because there's a page dedicated to each of 10 major emotions, one of which is anger. So here are ways to describe anger: aggravation, agitation, annoyance, bitterness, exasperation, ferocity, frustration, fury, grouchiness, grumpiness, hostility, indignation, irritation, outrage, rage, vengefulness, and wrath. And here are some prompting events for feeling anger. Having an important goal blocked, you or someone you care about being attacked or threatened by others, losing power, status, or respect, not having things turn out as expected, physical or emotional pain. On the handout, there's also interpretations of events that prompt feelings of anger, and these are distinct from the actual events. These are thoughts that I have about the events. These aren't the facts of what happened. This is what I think about what happened. And that includes believing that you have been treated unfairly, blaming, believing that important goals are being blocked or stopped. And remember, again, belief is different from reality. I can have the thought that that person is blocking my goal. It doesn't actually mean that they are, in fact, blocking my goal. But me having the thought that they are will absolutely prompt anger. Believing that things should be different than they are, which is judging, that will also prompt anger. Rigidly thinking I'm right, judging that the situation is illegitimate or wrong, ruminating about the event that set off the anger in the first place. That will also prompt feelings of anger. So me sitting here and thinking about past events that caused anger will have me feel anger in the present, even though that event is no longer happening. So what does it feel like in my body when I experience anger? These are biological changes and experiences of anger, and they include muscles tightening, teeth clamping together, and I mentioned that, how tight my jaw was when I was having a lot of anger come up. Hands clenching, feeling your face flush or get hot, feeling like you're going to explode, being unable to stop tears, wanting to hit someone, bang the wall, throw something, or blow up, wanting to hurt someone. So those are all things that happen inside me. Somebody on the outside may not necessarily be able to see that. And then we have expressions and actions of anger, which are things that I do as a result. They also include urges. These are things that you could record on camera. Somebody else on the outside could see these. And they include physically or verbally attacking, making aggressive or threatening gestures, pounding, throwing things, breaking things, walking heavily, stomping, slamming doors, walking out, using a loud, quarrelsome, or sarcastic voice, using obscenities or swearing, criticizing or complaining, clenching your hands or fists, frowning, not smiling, a mean expression, brooding or withdrawing from others, crying, grinning, a red or flushed face. So all of that is what I do, my behavior as a result of feeling angry. And then finally, we have the after effects of anger, or the echoes of anger. And these are how anger will affect my behavior throughout the day. So they include narrowing of attention, attending only to the situation that's making you angry, and forgetting everything else. That's a lot like road rage. I could be on the way to the hospital, and if someone cuts me off and I suddenly have this like massive burst of road rage, I will focus exclusively on tailgating that person and flipping them off rather than going to the hospital. That's an example. That's not from experience. And me saying that is not sarcastic either. I've never actually followed somebody in a fit of road rage. Another after effect or echo of anger is imagining future situations that will make you angry. Depersonalization, dissociative experiences, or numbness. I have that all the time. That's one of the key features of anger for me, is that I will feel like I'm not real or I'm not here. I will feel like the argument that I just had didn't happen, that I made the whole thing up. It's just a hallucination. So yes, I was definitely feeling quite a bit of anger. And as a result, also having a lot of judgment. And so I talked about non-judgment a little bit. I mentioned that my dad judged me. He labeled me as stubbornly negative. Then I kind of transposed that in a non-judgmental way. So my behavior, the way I was behaving, did not work for my dad. My dad did not like the way I was behaving. And he had the thought that he wished I would behave differently. And that takes a lot of the charge out of it, for me at least, because it's not about any sort of moral correctness. It's more a matter of preference and impact. I also mentioned that I wanted to say, I wish my parents cared enough about me to change their behavior, which is a judgment. I'm saying that they don't care. My parents don't care about me. And there's no way to get that on tape. Like, I can't record that. So saying it using non-judgment would go something like, I wish my parents were doing more of some behaviors, like going to therapy, and learning skills like validation at the rate that I want them to be learning it. And their lack of skill around this has an impact on me that is painful. Which is probably a more effective way of communicating than saying that my parents don't care about me. Another thing I wanted to mention before ending here is the baseball analogy. I've used that a lot in my regular life, but I think I've also mentioned it several times on the podcast. Like a 6-year-old kid coming up in the middle of the World Series and being like, hey you pitcher, I've got my bat, throw the ball to me. I was talking to my sister the other day about this very thing, about a mismatch between the skills required and our perception of our skill level and our actual skill level. And I said that willingness to do a thing, like eagerness to do a thing, doesn't necessarily translate into ability to do that thing. Like willingness to help doesn't necessarily translate into ability to help. Like, if my dad ever has to get brain surgery, I could really, really, really want to help the brain surgeon. I'm like, I really want to save my dad. Can I help? And the brain surgeon, rightfully and by necessity, is going to say, fucking no. You're not a brain surgeon. You are not allowed in here. You will get in the way. You don't know what you're doing. And my severe desire to help doesn't change that. It doesn't suddenly turn me into a brain surgeon, but it's hard to tell an adult that they don't have the skill when they really, really think that they do. So yeah, that's an ongoing challenge with my parents. Alrighty, so I'm going to wrap up, but before I forget, I want to give a huge thank you and shout out to my Patreon supporters. We've got a nice little troop of folks donating. Sunny and Juicy recently started supporting me on Patreon. Holy shit. Thank you. Andrew has been supporting me for a couple months now, so a massive, massive thank you to Andrew. And of course, I can't forget my original supporters, Anne and Ruth, who've been with me since the beginning. You all are crenulated spiny lobsters and are 93.8% of the reason this podcast exists for public consumption. So thank you a tremendous, tremendous amount. And if you, dear listener, would like to support this podcast, if you find it useful, the link to my Patreon is in the description. And that, as they say, is that. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being along with me on this very wet-sounding journey. And I'm just going to do my usual thing and end this super abrupt. This has been Let's Therapize That Shit with your host, me, Joy Gerhard.
If you like what you heard, please rate, review, subscribe, and tell your friends about it. I'll see you next time. Intro and outro music is Swan Lake Opus 20 by Tchaikovsky, performed by the London Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Anatoly Fistulari, and released on LP by Richmond High Fidelity London Records in 1952.